شكرا لك الكريم. هو المرجو مراعاة المدة الزمنية وهي 20 دقيقة كأقصى حد.
Okay, so good afternoon everyone. I'm sorry, I need to switch and take you directly to English. I'm Nadia Isaouin. I'm a lecturer محاضرة أستاذة باحثة بكلية أو جامعة روم in Germany, Almanya. So I'm working on intercultural communicative competence and the supervision of Professor Dr. Kranish Sibenia. يعني أنا البحث ديالي والمشروع البحث كله في ألمانيا ماشي سكند سوبرفايزر ولكن هي بريم سوبرفايزر. يعني أنا جيت من ألمانيا المغرب جوست على الكونفرنس ديالكم. Okay, so I will start by giving you a general structure of my presentation. So I will let you know my research topic or area in linguistics, what linguistics exactly, giving you some key concepts in literature, the methodology I adopted to conduct this study, the results I come up with so far, some limitations and the recommendations in addition to conclusion. So my field research is under the umbrella of applied linguistics. So it contains or it encompasses communication studies and cultural studies. And the topic, as I said, is intercultural communicative competence. اللي هي مهارة تواصل ثقافات والتواصل بين الحضارات. I'm so sorry مع ما استعملت هذا الترجمة بالعربية exact ولكن ممكن يكون غلطة فيه بصفة عامة هذا هو الموضوع. So the process of teaching and learning a foreign language includes getting to know other cultures. يعني طالب can I switch from English to Arabic? Yeah? Okay. Just to facilitate it to the audience. يعني الطالب اللي تيكون تيقرا واحد اللغة كلغة أجنبية اللي هي مثلا English as a case, he should or he must come into contact with other cultures. يعني الطالب اللي كيقرا واحد اللغة ما نقدروش نسمو ثقافة على اللغة. داكوغ تيقرا يعني اللغة تيقرا معاها ثقافة. Which means that foreign language education is itself, by definition, an intercultural enterprise. However, it has been criticized by scholars that we should move from producing near native speakers to enhance intercultural awareness. Which means, and the objective why I have chosen this topic, ماشي practical في هذا الوقت أننا يكونوا عندنا خريجين ديال اللغة الأجنبية ولكن عنده غير المهارة اللغوية ولكن ما عندوش مهارة التواصل مع الثقافات. يعني فاش كنقولوا التواصل مع الثقافات راه كيوقع الكالتشر شوك، يعني الواحد كيتقلق كيدابز تيكون كونفليكت كبير غير من داك سوء التفاهم كنقولوا حنا ولا سوء الفهم. So this is the objective of my research, is really to produce intercultural communicator competent but not only linguistic, let's say, competence. So the term ICC, which is intercultural communication competence, is revised and introduced by different scholars. So Hans, for example, based on grammatical and sociolinguistic competence, Canale and Swain, for example, focused on grammatical, sociolinguistic, and strategic competence. But Byram, I would say, include different aspects or different competences which are example, the attitude, which is a precondition factor before interacting with people, which is the savoir-être, so the intercultural attitude, which means أنه الطالب لازم يكون عنده ذيك attitude to be open, to be curious, to know more about other cultures. In doing so, then the participant will develop his knowledge in terms of the savoir, that is savoir of self and savoir of other and savoir of individual and societal, let's say, level. Then we have the skills, which are savoir apprendre and savoir comprendre, and then also the critical cultural awareness, which is savoir s'engager. And this is the very critical factor, I would say, in included environment model is le savoir s'engager. يعني هيكون مثلا طالب عنده شهاده في اجازه ولا ماستر ولا ميم دكتوراه في الانجليزيه، ولكن مازال ما قادرش يتانتجرا كي كنقولوا مع المجتمع اللي هو غير مغربي، مازال عنده تخوف، مازال عنده ستيريوتايبس، كيشوف الناس يقول لك لا هذوك غير اليهود، لا هذوك الكفره بالله etc. So they are stereotypes which haven't been developed. So before collecting the final data for my PhD project, I conducted this pilot study, and the objective behind it was to explore ICC level among participants to ensure that the instructions, questions are clear enough, to check whether my participants can understand the survey. يعني خلاص تعطينا مثلا الكاستيونير ممكن يكونوا بعض الاسئله ما واضحاش، سو انا ما غاديش نجي للتالي ديال بي اتش دي بروجيكت وعاد نعطيهم الكويشنير ونبقى راسي بلي راه الطلبه ما فاهمينش انا داكشي اللي بغيت نقول، which means البروبليم ماشي من الطلبه، البروبليم مني انا يعني ريسيرشر كباحثه. To pick up let's say offensive questions، نعطيكم مثال فاش سولت على الايتم تاع الجندر تاع السكس، واش ماسكولين ولا فيمينين، يعني الطلبه الالمانيه مثلا عطيتهم male, female, other, because they do believe in that, and I would say they are open to say no. أنا ماشي مثلا male or female, I'm non-binary, yeah. But in Morocco it might be offensive. وشنو هذه جايه باش تقولي واش أنا male or female ولا other؟ أنا yes, I am either male or female, so it's a question of culture again. So my research questions attempt to explore the ICC level among BA students, from Germany and Morocco, and to see if there is or there are differences among participants with intercultural affiliation or intercultural background. So in terms of methodology, as I said, it's higher education context, so التعليم العالي، طلبة ديال التعليم العالي, and they are English department students, so not other departments. Sorry. And my participants belong to Moroccan universities, so Willy Ismail University in Meknes, and Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah University in Fez, and Bonn University in Germany, where I do teach, and there are some Erasmus students. في ألمانيا ضروري الطالب يدير exchange program، يعني أنا مثلا ما كاينش سمستر اللي غادي نقرا فيه غير الطلبة الألمانيين، كنقصد بالألمانيين اللي مسجلين في الجامعة الألمانية من الأول، يكونوا جنسيات أخرى ولكن مسجل مقيم تما. كنهضر على طلبة مثلا كيجيو بإيراسموس بروغرام، بحال هذا العام عندي طلبة بزاف مثلا من تشيلي، من إسبانيا، من لي زيتازوني، ضروري الطالب خاصو يمشي يدير exchange program. And I know it's not the case in Morocco. يعني أنا خريجة الجامعة المغربية وخريجة يعني كلية الآداب بالكناس، عارفة هذه ما كايناش هذه البوسيبيليتي إلا اللي عنده الفلوس، إلا اللي قادر etc. And this is a very let's say critical factor to develop intercultural communication competence. So to collect my quantitative data, I used a questionnaire. The questionnaire includes closed and open-ended questions. It was online and in person. اضطريت نجلس في المغرب 8 شهور to be honest باش ندير data collection مع الطلبة المغرب هنا. الطلبة الألمانية درت معهم online. And I used SAT, which is تشوفوا من هذا مثلا باش تشوفوا السيناريو exactly. So in terms of results, most participants in both groups are between 18 to 21 years old, and most of them are female. So it was a random sampling. أنا ما اختاريتش هاللي مثلا ركزت من الأول يكونوا الدراري بزاف البنات بزاف no. And I distributed the questionnaire, but the results were that. In Germany, 91% are German, and Morocco, 99% are Moroccans, only one from Ivoria, and 9% in Germany from other cultures, which is Persian Indian background. Now the results. So, when I asked some items to elicit information about their intercultural background, I found that Moroccan participants are the more ones who have taken intercultural communication as a course in their BA program, but in Germany only 9%. Okay? In terms of abroad experience, you can see that all German participants have had the chance to visit other countries, where Morocco is only 7%. And we know what are the reasons behind that. In terms of working with other cultures, so I would say that most of them haven't worked with other cultures, abroad or even in their home country, and most of them belong to, let's say, one monoculture family. Les parents ديالهم يا مغاربة يا les Allemands. Another factor is contact abroad. The majority of them have friends, have family abroad. And you know, with social media and all, let's say, modern communication, they do have people, they are communicating and interacting with people, but not in person or not face to face. So it's mediated communication and it's totally different. The last factor is the international affiliation or intercultural affiliation. So we can see that the majority are German participants who are active in some international or intercultural clubs or activities, for example. So these are the most frequently, let's say, visited countries. If they have been in some countries before and what. So la majority kind of English-speaking countries. And here the results concerning the 4 dimensions I mentioned: knowledge, attitude, skills, and critical cultural awareness. So we can see here that 39% of the Moroccan participants perceive themselves as fair at being willing to suspend disbelief about other cultures. I'm sorry. So in contrast, only about 45%. So in contrast, only about 45% of the German participants who are perceiving themselves as not having this attitude at all. So they are not willing to know about other cultures or to be open to other cultures. The second factor, which is knowledge, the results show that the majority of BA participants in both universities rate their readiness to develop knowledge of social practices and other groups by seeking contact with them as fair. 33% fair from Morocco and 45% from Germany. So, however, 18% from the BA perceive themselves as very good, while this value is completely absent. So you can see here that the other value is completely absent in Germany, or among German participants. When it comes to skills, 82% of participants from Germany evaluate their ability to, let's say, interpret and relate events according across their own culture and others' culture as fair, whereas 60% of the Moroccan participants or respondents reported this competence as fair, and 22% see themselves good at these skills and 18% as poor. The last dimension, which is critical cultural awareness, so respondents here have reported their ability to evaluate critically based on explicit criteria, for example, practices and products in their own other cultures. So the result shows that the majority of them really are not happy or are not satisfied with their performance, and it's obvious that none is very good at critical cultural awareness. So the results show that the score of critical cultural awareness competence remains somehow similar among German and Moroccan universities. There is not a significant difference, I would say, here in this dimension. Going back to the DCT, so I told you that students were asked about some scenarios. So for example here, مثلا الطالب المغربي سول انه مثلك واحد في لي بارون ديالك داكوغ، وعندك صاحبك امريكاني وكاين في المغرب عايش في المغرب ساكن في نفس المدينه، هز التليفون وقال لك I'm sorry for your loss because هكا اللي زعما كان كيقول كيفاش كتشوفها، واش surprising or not. نفس السيناريو مع مغربي مثلك واحد طول العمر، this is just an example، ومن بعد هز التليفون وقال لك بركه في راسك وصافي، يعني a close friend. So when it comes to an American, let's say, participant in this communication episode, 50% were surprised and only 85% not surprised. However, when it comes to a Moroccan one, it's 62%. It's more surprising when it comes to interaction with the Moroccan one. For German participants, they were asked the same scenario. So when it comes to Moroccan, 14% who are surprised, and when it comes to interaction with German, only 36%. So we can see here that the surprise, for Moroccan participants, interacting with the Moroccan participants, the surprise is very high, or disappointment, I would say, also, or frustration. Data results can be interpreted as follows. So Moroccan BA respondents reported higher mean scores than the German on knowledge. So they perceive or they think they are very knowledgeable about intercultural communication. Maybe because they know what is the research about. They seem to have scored on the critical cultural awareness. So these participants really need to step forward to be able to achieve an evaluative analysis. So not only interacting, but having the critical thinking competence. So Moroccan participants, we can say, because 58% are curious to know about other cultures, and they have already learned or taken this course. So the limitations of this study, I would say, it's a reflection-based self-evaluation. أنا ما درتلهمش assessment كأستاذة، ولكن هما اللي داروا l'évaluation راسهم. Qualitative research methodology could be used also to answer some questions. علاش مثلا فاش كتقول له راه هذاك المغربي يقول لك لا يعني سربرايز تمايا وما عجبوش الحال علاش عيطوا في التليفون وقال له غير البركه في راسك، ولكن مع الامريكاني ماشي مشكل. So I need to answer these questions. Teaching approach also were not conducted. كيفاش قراو مثلا الماده ولا كيفاش تقرات الماده في الBA. There were no real interactions. يعني الاسسمنت ما كانتش تحطهم مثلا مع الناس اللي هما ماشي مغادرين تشوفهم كيفاش غادي يتواصلوا معاهم. And lack of use of treatment in terms of teaching. So I highly recommend as a researcher, based on this research, to integrate ICC in teaching foreign languages to be able to produce competent intercultural business communicators because they are, they tend to apply for the job market. يعني كيف ما بيكون تخصص ديال الطالب أدبي علمي كل واحد تيقرا باغي يخدم. This is reality. Alors باش غادي تخدم soyez sûr et certain que دابا ما غاديش تخدم غير مع المغاربة وحدهم فين ما مشيتي راه الناس مخلطين due to globalization. So to conclude, as a conclusion, so interesting differences between German and Moroccan participants. As I said, it was a self-evaluation, and German students tend to rate themselves as fair, whereas Moroccan students rather evaluate themselves as good. So if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate. You can ask me in Arabic, whatever, feel free. And thank you for your attention.
شكرا جزيلا للطالبة الباحثة نادية زعنوي. نشكرها كذلك على أن تنقل من ألمانيا لحضور إشغال هذه الندوة. نادية زعنوي التي أكدت على أنه لا يمكن الفصل بين اللغة والثقافة، وأكدت كذلك على ضرورة توفر قابلية للانفتاح على ثقافات أخرى. قامت ببحث عبر تقديم استمارة لطلبة ألمانيا، والنتائج أبانت عن ضعف نسبي في تملك المهارة التواصلية. ما يقع هو أن الطلبة في الحالات لهم مهارة لغوية ولا يتوفرون على مهارة تواصلية، خصوصا في ما يتعلق بالتداخل الثقافي. إذا أفتح باب النقاش وأبدأ بالأستاذ توفيق شعفاري دون تردد. هذا أمر الرئيس.
أمر الرئيس. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I think the topic which you are researching is not a new topic. Probably it's new in Germany, but this is a topic which has been really so much research in Morocco, and we have, I think, Professor Bouzien in our school here, who did a lot of research on that. And also, when you talk about intercultural communication competence, now we no longer talk about intercultural communication. Why? Simply because the world is closing in. And now we are heading towards one culture, which is universal culture. So wherever you go, you seem to find people behaving, thinking, dressing in the same way. Okay, even the cultural tips which used to be somehow ethnic oriented are no longer ethnic oriented. And there is one thing that I think which Professor Wesley talked about concerning we cannot dissociate language from its culture. Never. And the more you learn about the language, the more cultural background you adopt. So this is something which it's not something that you like. It's something that you live it. You live because sometimes language. There are some concepts in certain languages which are not simply words. They are institutions. Okay, when we talk, for example, about I would say an example, if we talk about breakfast in England, the English breakfast. The English breakfast is not the same as any breakfast in the world. Okay, the English breakfast is, it's a whole body. Okay, so and of course, when we talk about was a professor in Morocco. I don't remember his name. I think his name is, I think Lucy. He talked about this. He said, when we learn the language, we have to make we have to make good use of the language, and we should not use the language for its own purposes. We have to learn the language for our own purposes. In other words, of course, when we talk about a language, there is an ideology behind the language. We have to pay attention to that. So, and another thing which I would like you to consult, there is, I think, somebody who is the pioneer of intercultural communication, who is, I think his name is Edward Hall. He worked on intercultural communication back in 1959. So, and then we have other people who worked in the 1990s. So, in your work, especially in the theoretical part, go to these pioneers on which you can. Sorry if I'm late. Okay, I think. Sorry if I got late, but this is my. I think because it's you who ordered me. So good luck. Thank you very much. Yes.
شكرا جزيلا للأستاذة نادية. هذا سؤال لا يمكن أن نشير أيضا إلى عنصر التحولات representation في تعلم اللغة أو على تمكن المتعلم من ثقافة اللغة والمتكلمين، ثقافة المتكلمين أقصد. وهنا شرح لي ستيفن كراشن أعتقد ما سماه بالمصفات العاطفية أو الرشيد الفعلي، وأعتقد أن براون 1941 أيضا أشار إلى عنصر الثقافة واللغة في هذا الموضوع. شكرا جزيلا.
We can give her the end. She will.
ماشي كويشن عندك غير كاميرا تما
شكرا للاستاذ طبعا. في الحقيقه الاستاذ عبادي تحدث قليلا عن العلاقه التي لا تفصل بين الثقافه واللغه. فعلا هذا ولد عليه ادبيات كثيره منذ اختراع ديال صافي وظائف النسبيه الثقافيه، وان كل لغه تختزن في تعبيرها عن ثقافتها. بل اكثر من هذا، حتى عندما نريد ان نعبر ثقافه اخرى فيكون سندنا هو اللغه نفسه. ولكن انا لدي ملاحظه حول هذا النوع من الابحاث بصفه عامه. تبدو لي هذا النوع من الابحاث لا ينطلق من افتراضات ويذهب من خلال مساءله بعض الابعاد لكي يصل الى النتائج، ولكن تبدو لي ان الابحاث ينطلق اصلا من مسلمه، وكانه يستعمل مجموعه من الابعاد لكي يبرر المسلم. يعني اساسا نعم ماشي هايبوثيسيس، هو بحال ان بوستولا، يعني شيء نسلم به، وهو ان هؤلاء هذه العينه ما عندهاش الاي سي سي. اشنا هو السبب علاش ما عندهاش اي سي سي؟ اذا الذين مسلمه ونبحث عن تبريرها وليس العكس. ليس لدينا افتراضات، لان المساله هي ماشي مساله ان نحصل على تبرير لهذه المسلمه. المساله هي ان نحصل على القيمه الدقيقه والتدرجات التي توجد، لانه من السهل ان نحكم بنعم ام لا، ولكن من الصعب ان نعرف ما هي الدرجات والنيونس والفروق التي توجد في بصدد كل مكون من المكونين. فقط وصلت الابحاث اللسانيه الى ان ما هو خاص يعني هو محدود بالمقارنه بين ما هو عام. تقريبا الى درجه انه ممكن نتحدث عن نسبه الكلي اكبر من الخاص تماما واكثر. النقطه الثانيه، هذا المشكل في الحقيقه المهاره التواصليه يعني عشنا معها في المغرب في السنوات الاخيره بشكل كبير. كلما اثير النقاش بشان الاصلاح الجامعي الى درجه انه اصبح كمان ان المشكل المطروح اليوم مثلا هو في المهاره التواصليه. هل الامر يتعلق بمشكل لغوي او مشكل ثقافي؟ لان ربما الاستاذ في تلخيصه عظيم وكذلك اشرت الى ربما قد يكون الشخص او الطالب له قدره هائله على المستوى اللغوي ولكن على المستوى التواصلي. ولكن مع ذلك هل يمكن ان نجد رابطا بين هذا الامر؟ وبالتالي هل الامر يتعلق بمشكل ثقافي محض ام هو مشكل لغوي حتى ولو كان الشخص يمتلك قدره لغويه عاليه؟
So thank you so much for your comments and your questions. I will start with the latest question when you talked about representation or representations. So we're talking about communication, yeah? And language is a way or is a tool to communicate. And when we do communicate, we can communicate with language, I mean with verbal signs or non-verbally, including, for example, symbols, including signs, including meta-communication that we don't directly communicate but we still understand it. So it exists. We cannot communicate without representation. So the terms I'm using now, for example, or when we, again, humor, when we talk about humor, and like yesterday in a conference, I said just impossible. So you know what I mean, and it means something to the Moroccan context, for example, now, yeah? So it's a question of choice of the use of language. What do you say, how you say it, and when, and it has, of course, it has meanings, not only one meaning. So if we need to take representation into consideration, it should be developed, through knowledge as a component environmental model. Students should learn as much as possible about other cultures, what they say, how they, for example, what they have in their breakfast, how and sometimes even why. Yeah? So Moroccan breakfast, الفطور اللي كنفطروا حنا يوميا ماشي هو الفطور الجديد. جو كخوا بري تولي انا بيرسونيلمون دوزت مثلا كندوز التمارين شنو كديروا في الفطور؟ Alors it's something special. Yeah, we don't talk about normal breakfast, but we talk about elite breakfast. So it has to do with knowledge. To develop that, we shouldn't stop only on knowledge. ما بقيناش باغيين حنا غير المعرفه. راه الطالب ولا اي واحد ياخذ يدخل على الانترنت غيلقى بزاف يقول لك عرفتي كيديروا هكا وكيديروا هكا كيف. And what after? Are you able to develop your skills to communicate effectively? Not successfully, but effectively. Which means the objective is to understand what I meant, not what you understood. No, this is not what, and there is a book which is called "This is not what I meant." يعني يكون عندنا واحد common understanding. This is beyond. At the same time, I try to comment or to ask what you, to comment what you've asked or mentioned is beyond the linguistic competence, but it's the pragmatic competence and the intercultural competence. تقدر تهضر واحد كيسمعك ولكن still not effective. الناس كيهضروا حتى اللي كيدابزوا. علاش ما فهمنيش شنو قلت له ما فهمتنيش هو قالتها هكا وعوجات فمها وخزرت فيا etc. So this
عبارة مهارات أو كفاية تواصلية استحضروني اسم ديال جيمس جون جوجل اشتغل على خلافات أو سوء التفاهم بين أشخاص ينتمون إلى ثقافات مختلفة. هذا هو الإطار النظري الذي اعتمدت عليه.
I'm sorry, guys. I thought you are talking to them and I was sending a message that I'm done and they need to go. I'm sorry.
اسم باحثين مثل جيمس.
Yeah. So that's for introduction. لا عطيت هذاك التعريف الاي سي سي شحال من سكولر كل واحد عطى التعريف ديالو. انا I based on Byron's model because it's the one that deals with intercultural communication at the territorial level ولا at higher education يعني في التعليم ماشي غير intercultural communication en général ولكن في التعليم حيت الشريحه ديالي كيبحثوا مع الطلبه ديال الشعب اللغه الانجليزيه.
إذن أول مرة أنا جد سعيد بالحضور الطلبة واللغة القلة لأن حضوركم هو تعزيز وتقوية للسانية في البحث اللساني. اللسانية التي أصبحت تعاني من الأفول وأنا منذ تواجدي في كلية الأدب بمسك منذ 26 سنة وأنا أواكب هذه استماتة شعبة اللغة العربية وأذكر على أستاذ شفا ومن بعده أستاذ حفيظ، أستاذ رشاد، أستاذ غريب، أستاذ مجري، أشكركم واصلوا الحضور. إذا نمر مباشرة إلى العرض التالي الذي سيقدمه زكريا زنود باحث في اللسانيات التطبيقية يشتغل على موضوع جنس العربية الإعلامية تحليل لساني متعدد الأبعاد تحت إشراف الأستاذ إقبال الدليل وبطبيعة الحال جامعة محمد الخامس في الرباط العقد سيقدم طبعا في اللغة الإنجليزية. نشكر الأستاذ توفيق الجعفري مشرف اللغة الإنجليزية لحضوره لتعزيز الحضور وبالتالي الإجابة وطرح أسئلة في خصوص المقدمة باللغة الإنجليزية. شكرا أستاذ.
السلام عليكم. الصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So it's my great pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you my knowledge, my thoughts, and my research in my PhD studies. And my gratitude goes very specifically to Professor Jafar, Professor Jafar, and all the organizing committee who have organized this great event. Right, so what I'm presenting today is a part of my dissertation, which is an investigation into the structures, functions of media Arabic genre using Douglas-Biber's multidimensional analysis. But before uncovering the content, the data, and its interpretation of the study, I would like to start and to introduce some concepts which, to my knowledge, form the cornerstone of the study. So, one of these concepts is genre. Now, what I mean by media Arabic is Arabic العربية التي تستعمل في الإعلام ببناها وبوظائفها المتميزة. Now, what did I call, or why did I call media Arabic a genre? So, this is to name media Arabic a genre is to raise a number of critical issues related to the terminology and conceptual framework. So, genre is defined and supported also from evidence drawn from Swales and Martin. So, genre, from a functional perspective, it reflects the cultural context within which texts are constructed.
And there are clear distinctions between genre and text type. Because genre is defined according to external parameters. Now text type is defined on the basis of linguistic internal dimensions and parameters. Of course, we shouldn't confuse genre text type with style, domain, and register, because style is different. Now, when we talk about style, we talk about the individual use of language. For instance, we can talk about the style of Shakespeare, the style of John Steinbeck, the style of Ernest Hemingway. In Arabic, we can talk about the style of Al-Jahid, the style of Taha Hussein or Taimur and others. So style is the individual use of language, different from genre. Domain is a criterion. Register, according to David Lean and the distinguished professor of applied linguistics, David Nonan, is defined as a configuration of field, tenor, and node. So it's different from genre. So based on this conceptual framework, we can consider media Arabic as a genre. Why? Because it has external parameters and it has also linguistic internal features. So media Arabic can be considered as subordinate text, which branches into, for example, magazine, newspapers, radio, and each one of these categories of text branches in itself into subordinate levels, such as politics, science, culture and arts, literature. Now, my question or my study starts in this context. I mean, what are the linguistic characteristics that distinguishes between an article published in science from another published in literature? And ما هي المزايا اللسانية الصرفية والتركيبية التي تميز نصا نشر في مجال العلم أو الثقافة في مجلة معينة عن نص آخر نشر في السياسة والمجتمع من طرف نفس المجلة. So my study tries to investigate this kind of features and internal linguistic characteristics of this text. In a more systematic method, I would like to answer these questions. So, what are the sets of lexicogrammatical patterns that co-occur in media Arabic genre? And how frequent those lexicogrammatical features are distributed in the text? And I focus on two lexicogrammatical categories, tenses and verbs. And to what extent media Arabic texts differ from each other lexically and grammatically. Of course, this is a twofold study. The first part is devoted to the quantitative method, and the second part is basically functional. Because when we have this data of frequencies and scores, we have to interpret them on the basis of functions. So this is the answer to the last question, which is why are particular sets of lexicogrammatical features co-occur in a particular media Arabic text and not in another. To my knowledge, and from the literature I have viewed, I've seen that the best method to investigate this kind of phenomenon, linguistic phenomenon, is the multidimensional model of Douglas Bible. Of course, Douglas Bible is some kind of model, but there have been a lot of development which this model undergone. So it was pioneered in the 1980s, but it has developed very quickly and very effectively in the subsequent decades. Now, the multidimensional analysis is basically a quantitative method which is used to investigate the convergence or the divergence of linguistic features. And here I want to mention a very significant concept, which is the co-occurrence. Now, if you have, for example, the co-occurrence of some linguistic features which co-occur in a text, so here there is an underlying dimension or underlying function which encourages this kind of use of language. If you take this co-occurrence, you have to compare it in looking or in regard to specific number of dimensions, which we call statistically factors. Now the method goes as following. It has 6 steps. The first one is designing a corpus, then designing a set of linguistic features annotation scheme, and then tagging all these linguistic schemes, linguistic features in the corpus, then moving to choosing some computer programs which have been used in NLT, or natural language processing in Arabic, so in order to tag and to count the frequencies of linguistic features. And the fourth one is analyzing the co-occurrence patterns among linguistic features, computing dimension scores, and finally to interpret the functions of the factors. And here there are two sources which the researcher has to go to. One of them is the previous literature studies that have been conducted to date, and the second thing is the contextual observation of data or the co-occurrence of the features into their context. Now, let's move to a practical journey of this study. I want to move to the practical part of the study. So, the corpus I have designed is media Arabic corpus, which consists of written press, it's the written mode of language, print and online, that ranges from Morocco, for example, Akhbar newspaper, to Algeria, Shuruk, to Tunisia, to Egypt, and from the Levant countries such as Palestine and Syria, and from the Gulf region such as Saudi Arabia, such as Kuwait, alright, and Qatar. The subgenres I wanted to investigate are 10. So, from politics, economics, society, sports, to religion. So here I try to find some differences and similarities on the basis of language between these subgenres using the multidimensional model. The number of words is approximately 106,000 words, and the aggregate number of text is 212. So the minimum number of text which is required by factor analysis I'm going to use as a part of the multidimensional model is 200. Now I have 212, so it's a meritorious value. The linguistic annotation scheme which I have focused on and which I mentioned earlier is two categories. So the tenses and verbs from past, present, and future, and for example verbs of imminence, which we call them in Arabic af'al al-muqaraba, and verbs of probability, af'al al-rujhan, and other kinds of verbs in Arabic. These are some procedures which I have used in the study. Of course, they are essential because any researcher cannot manually count the frequencies of occurrences of linguistic features in the text. If he chooses to do so, it would take long time and very immense effort. So I've chosen Madamira and Farasa as natural language processing tools in order to tag the corpus and the linguistic features. Of course, it was not 100% accurate, but personally I had a team of students which are studying in the branch of Arabic linguistics, and they have helped me a lot in tagging and manually revise the tagging of the linguistic features, with coping with some challenges on the basis of corpus and computational techniques. Now, as you have this number of occurrences of the features in a text, so are those raw frequencies objective in order to analyze the data? It's not. Why? Because if you have, let's take an example of a text that numbered in 500 and another one is numbered in 1,000 words. So if you have the past tense, the occurrence of past tense, which is 40 in the first one, 500 words, and the second one contains 42, the occurrence of past tense form. So can we say that the second text uses much more past tense than the other? No, it's not objective. Why? Because we have to normalize the tag count and to multiply the result of the occurrences per specific number of words. The average is suggested in 1,000, suggested by this simple calculation, which is the number of instances divided into total number of words multiplied by 1,000. So here I'm running the factor analysis. So as you see, there are more than 16 factors which are dominating the corpus, but the task of the researcher is to select and to try to have a picture of the dominant factors which shows salient term in the plot. And here we can say that there are 3 factors which are dominating the corpus, 3 linguistic factors, which are also above 1 eigenvalue. So I've selected 3 factors. Here is another way to select the factors are dominating. Now, there are 3 factors. The first one, second one, which explains about 36 total eigenvalues of variation in the corpus. Okay, here it's more statistical, but it's simple. Why? Because there are some occurrences. Now, if you have values which are close to 1, there is a strong correlation between the co-occurrence of linguistic features. If you have a value which is closer to -1, then there is weak correlation between the features. Take, for example, let's take the verb probability. Verb probability is the last one. It has a value of 47 with past tense. So past tense and verb tend to co-occur with verb probability in certain number of texts. On the other hand, for example, we have future that uses particles of L and M, so there's a weak correlation with future with K, which is -0.041, so it's a weak correlation. So here there is a summary of the factors, factor 1 and 2. Now the task is, or the procedure is to select the values which are closer to 1 and to categorize them in a table which can be presented as following. So in factor 1, I will just for the sake of summary, I would like to go into detail of the factor 1. Factor 1, verbs of probability tends to co-occur with future with in, the particle, with present tense, with can and sisters, past tense, future with subparticle, passive form, and imperative. Now, if you take a text, you will find a strong and firm co-occurrence of these linguistic features in a specific number of texts. If you go to another text, for example, politics or society, you will find overall absence of this factor. So far it is purely quantitative analysis of the data. Now here is the task of the researcher is to review the literature, to find out what is the function of each feature, and to find out also the common functional points between these features in order to give a label to each factor. Now the labels I have given to factor 1, factor 2, and factor 3 are factor 1 is narrative, situation dependent reference, because if you investigate the functions of verbs, probability, and future within and so on in the literature, you will find those common points and markers of narrativeness and situation dependence. The second one is abstract versus non-abstract information, continuous future relevant information. Experimentally, this can be shown in the following scale. So, society. Now, if you take an article in Media Arabic in society, you will find it more narrative, more situation dependent. In the opposite, economics, sports, and politics are negative categories of text, which are not or are far from narrativeness and situation dependent reference. So this is the data, but you can support it by looking into the context. Now, if I take an example of a text from society, which has a value of 6.346, so if you look at this, you will find general co-occurrence of verbs of past tense and also the present tense and passive voice, like here we have wasifat and terminate. So here you can notice this closeness and the co-occurrence of the features. There are other things which support the evidence of label with narrativeness and situation dependent, which are context. Now, there is indicators supported like setting, time, place, and persons, and also spatial indications, durations, modus sanity. They are linking particles, relative clauses or relative particles. Of course, we have lexical repetition, تحريات, which has been repeated more than twice and thrice in the text. Habitual action. Now, in a text that uses habitual actions and continuous habitual action, so it's narrative, and you can find this in a religion text. You can find this in fiction writings like novels and prose. So, yeah, so this is an evidence from context, from contextual observation of the labeling. Alright, so one of you might ask, what is the objective of this study and what is its implication for the research? Now, if you have this data, you can interpret it based on in a scientific method and a scientific approach. So, you can document the similarities and differences among texts. So you can know how a text published, for example, in Politics and Society differs from the other published in science and cultures and literature. But is there any objective of this? So there is another objective, which is to establish a typology of text types, which can be a reference for service designers in TOEFL, teaching Arabic as a foreign language, which can be a reference for typologists, because if you want to investigate a text, you have to know very well what kind of text you are investigating. You have to examine the approach based on statistics and based also on the computational reading of the text. Because now you cannot investigate a text using a manual approach. You cannot do that. It costs time, it costs effort, and it might cost money also. Okay, so this is the part of my study I've shared with you. I welcome your questions, your critics also, and if you are interested in the approach and study or any part of the research, you can